On a snowy afternoon in Yellowstone, the visitor center was filled with wildflowers and laughter, ready for a wedding that promised forever. Eleanor, the bride in white lace, walked the aisle beneath the gaze of friends and rangers who had guarded these lands with her. But before the vows could be spoken, a shadow limped through the open doors. An old German shepherd, scarred, weary, yet burning with purpose. He barked once, sharp and urgent, not at the groom, not at the guests, but toward the dark forest beyond. In that instant, joy turned into dread, and a love story became a battle for survival. Stay with us, because what happened next will leave you breathless. And before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story of loyalty and courage will travel. The morning air over Yellowstone carried a weight that only winter could bring. The skies were iron gray, stretched taut over endless valleys where pines bowed under the burden of snow. Flurries swept in slow spirals, dancing over the frozen ground before vanishing into the white silence. The wind had teeth, sharp enough to sting the cheeks and chisel every breath into a visible cloud. Yet beneath this stark beauty, the Visitor and Education Center stood glowing like a lantern against the storm, its log walls adorned with garlands of wildflowers gathered during the summer and preserved carefully by local volunteers. It was not a grand cathedral nor an ornate chapel. It was a home for those who had devoted their lives to the wild. And today, it would witness vows meant to last a lifetime. Inside, Eleanor stood near the tall windows that framed the snow-laden forest, her slender figure wrapped in a lace gown that trailed softly at her feet. At 28, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had spent years studying the fragility of ecosystems, but also with the quiet humility of a woman who had spent countless hours ankle-deep in mud, cataloging migratory birds or tracing the footprints of elk across meadows. Her hair, chestnut brown and falling in natural waves down her back, contrasted with her pale complexion that bore a light scattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her eyes, a gentle hazel with flecks of green, always seemed to hold both scientific curiosity and an almost childlike wonder. Years of fieldwork had left her lean and strong, though she carried herself not as a warrior, but as a guardian. Today, despite the radiant smile she wore, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a bouquet of dried lavender and mountain roses. Standing at the front of the hall was Michael, a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered with a height that lent him an almost imposing presence. His hair was dark blonde, clipped short at the sides, but long enough on top to show the occasional rebellious strand. His jawline was square, marked with faint scars from years in the backcountry, reminders of falls on icy trails and skirmishes with barbed wire fences during rescues. A trace of stubble covered his cheeks, not out of neglect, but because he was a man whose life was too filled with early mornings and emergencies to waste on vanity. His blue eyes, often as steady as the rivers he patrolled, carried both calm and caution, a reflection of someone who had lived through storms both literal and personal. Long ago, a fellow ranger, his closest friend, had been lost in a wildfire that spread faster than they could contain. Michael never spoke of it often, but the shadow of that day lingered in his guarded demeanor, shaping him into the man who could never leave another behind. Today, as he adjusted the simple tie at his collar, his lips softened into a rare smile reserved only for Eleanor. Around them, the hall filled with voices, the hum of local townspeople who had come not merely as guests, but as family of the land. Among them were fellow rangers in their green uniforms, their faces lined by wind and sun, scientists with notebooks peeking out of their coats, and townsfolk who knew Eleanor from her lectures at the education center, and Michael from his quiet patrols along Main Street. At the front row sat Nora, Eleanor's closest friend and fellow researcher, a woman in her early 30s with short-cropped auburn hair and a quick wit that had lightened many grim days in the field. She wore a teal dress that did little to disguise her pragmatic nature, and though she teased Eleanor endlessly about marrying a man married to the forest, her eyes glistened with pride. The officiant, a kindly older pastor with a beard turned mostly silver, raised his hands for silence. He was Reverend Carter, known in town for his gentle sermons about stewardship of creation rather than fire and brimstone warnings. His deep-set eyes reflected decades of guiding both hunters and hikers through moral storms, as much as spiritual ones. As his voice began to echo in the wood-beamed hall, speaking of vows and sacred promises, the storm outside intensified. Flakes battered against the glass, as though the wilderness itself leaned close to witness. It was then that the doors creaked open, sending a hush through the crowd. The wind howled in, carrying snow across the wooden floor, and into that swirl stepped a figure that was no man but a dog. He was large, his frame once powerful but now worn thin with age. His coat bore the rich sable pattern of a German shepherd, though streaked with silver that marked the passing years. His gait was uneven, one hind leg dragging slightly as he limped forward. His ears, though scarred and notched at the tips, stood alert, and his eyes, those amber eyes, cut through the room with a clarity that felt almost human. The murmur of the guests rose, some shifting uncomfortably, others whispering in recognition of the breed often associated with K-9 rescue units. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. She felt the bouquet slip from her fingers, lavender scattering at her feet. She knew this dog, or rather she knew him once, years ago, in a memory buried under avalanches and unanswered prayers. "Buddy," she whispered, so softly only Nora beside her could hear. Her knees threatened to give way. Buddy had been part of the park's experimental rescue team nearly 8 years prior, trained to detect lost hikers and avalanche survivors. He had been young then, strong and fearless, his bark a beacon in storms, and his loyalty unquestioned. Eleanor, fresh from graduate school, had been assigned to track his progress alongside the Rangers. They had worked side by side, forging a bond built not just on data, but on silent trust. But then came the winter storm that swallowed half a mountain. 2 climbers were lost, and Buddy had plunged into the whiteout with his handler, only to vanish. For days they searched. For weeks Eleanor wandered ridges, calling until her voice broke. But no trace had ever been found. Eventually, the park declared him dead, another victim of nature's wrath. Eleanor had buried his memory in the quiet corners of her soul, trying to accept that some echoes never return. And yet here he was, limping down the aisle as though no time had passed. His fur was matted from weather, his body thinner, his breath heavier with age. But his eyes were the same amber pools that had once met hers through falling snow, the same eyes that had stared down danger without flinching. He stopped halfway to the altar, his head tilting slightly, ears twitching at the sound of her voice. His tail gave one uncertain wag. The congregation gasped, some exchanging looks of disbelief. Michael stepped forward instinctively, protective but also bewildered. Reverend Carter paused mid-sentence, lowering his book. Nora whispered sharply, "Ellie, that's your dog, isn't it?" But Eleanor could not answer. Tears blurred her vision, hot against her cold skin. She took one hesitant step forward, her gown brushing against the wooden floor. "Buddy?" she said louder now, her voice trembling. Buddy's ears perked. He limped forward, each step measured, until he stood before her. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he pressed his scarred muzzle against her gown, his head resting against her trembling hands. The room held its breath. For Eleanor, the years dissolved. The storm of grief she had carried melted under the warmth of his fur. She dropped to her knees, arms encircling his neck, whispering his name again and again, as though it were a prayer rising from the very marrow of her being. The snow outside beat harder against the glass, rattling the frames as if to underscore the moment. Michael looked down at the pair. His bride and the dog returned from the dead. And though his mind raced with questions, he saw the unspoken truth. This was no coincidence. The wilderness had brought them back together for a reason, and deep within his chest, a ripple of unease stirred, for he knew in his bones that the forest never sent a messenger without a warning. The ceremony had been interrupted, but no one dared speak. All eyes were on the old dog, whose sudden return had shaken the room more than any storm ever could. Buddy stood now, leaning into Eleanor's touch, his amber eyes fixed not on the crowd, but toward the frost-fogged windows, as though something beyond the trees still called for him. And in that silence, Eleanor realized with a chill that this reunion wasn't an ending but the beginning of something far greater, something that would test not only their vows, but their very survival. The silence that had fallen inside the visitor center did not last. As whispers rippled through the crowd, Buddy shifted his weight and tugged gently at the hem of Eleanor's gown. The old German shepherd's claws scraped against the wood floor, his amber eyes restless, pulling not toward the groom or the pastor, but toward the storm-dark trees beyond the window. Eleanor hesitated, glancing first at Michael, then at the guests who looked both confused and uneasy. She knew the rhythm of animal instinct, and this was not a dog lost or seeking warmth. This was a dog trying to lead. With a steadying breath, she bent to gather her gown and followed Buddy's insistent pull. Michael moved quickly after her, excusing himself with a brief nod to Reverend Carter. His tall frame cut a determined path through the onlookers, his jaw tight, the ranger within him already alert. When the doors swung open again, snow swept inside like a curtain, stinging their faces. Eleanor pulled her cloak around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with cold, her long hair whipping free of its pins. Buddy's limp slowed him, but did not weaken his resolve. He pressed forward into the white blur as though the forest itself called his name. The parking area lay just beyond the lodge, rows of trucks and cars dusted in fresh snow. Michael's sharp eyes scanned across the lot, catching details with the precision that years in the backcountry had trained into him. It was then that he stopped, narrowing his gaze at a battered gray pickup sitting apart from the rest, half hidden behind a drift where it had no reason to be. Snow clung unevenly to its hood, and unlike the polished vehicles of guests, this one bore streaks of grime, mud dried in jagged lines along the fender. More telling was the dark stain spreading beneath the chassis, an oily pool on top of frozen gravel. Michael's boots crunched over the snow as he approached, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind. He leaned down, fingers brushing the slick black puddle, then lifted them, smelling the acrid tang of unfiltered oil. His brow furrowed, a memory stirring of past patrols where such stains marked makeshift hunting camps. He circled the truck, his breath forming steady clouds, and lifted the frayed tarp covering the bed. What lay beneath tightened his jaw even further. Inside was a cage, iron bars rusted, smeared with filth, the metal bent in places as though something had fought desperately to break free. Strands of coarse fur clung to the corners, a mix of tawny and black. Eleanor's breath hitched as she reached forward, gloved fingers gently plucking one hair free. She held it to the gray light, her hazel eyes narrowing. "This is no domestic animal," she whispered, her voice trembling with certainty. "This came from a wild creature, large, heavy-bodied, a wolf, or maybe a bear cub." Her pulse quickened, the instincts of years in research sharpening into alarm. Buddy sniffed the air around the truck, ears twitching, body tense. He let out a low growl, not aggressive but warning, and glanced at Eleanor as if urging her to understand. The scarred old dog moved with surprising focus, circling twice, before staring fixedly at the tree line where the storm thickened. Eleanor laid a hand on his head, feeling the coarse fur still damp with melted snow. "He's telling us," she murmured. "There's something still out there." Michael straightened, his blue eyes hardening with the weight of responsibility. "Illegal trapping," he said flatly. "Someone's working these woods again. This cage wasn't left by accident. They're here, or close." He looked down at Eleanor, the wind tugging at his coat. "You realize what this means? We're not just talking about a stray poacher. This," he gestured to the cage, "this is part of a network." From behind them, a voice cut through the snow. "You're right about that." They turned to see Deputy Hank Lawson stepping across the lot, his heavy boots leaving deep prints. Hank was in his early 40s, a broad man with a barrel chest and a trimmed beard peppered with gray. His uniform strained slightly at the shoulders, testimony to years of physical work. But his eyes, sharp blue and quick to assess, betrayed a man who trusted instincts as much as procedure. He had once served in the Marines before returning to his hometown, carrying with him a habit of suspicion sharpened by combat. Though known to the townsfolk as genial, he carried a lingering intensity, as if war had carved a permanent watchfulness into his face. Hank stopped at the truck, brushing snow from his jacket. "I saw that vehicle when I came in earlier. Didn't belong to any guest. Figured it was someone working deliveries. Guess I should have looked twice." He crouched, examining the cage, his brows knitting. "This isn't just sloppy poaching. They've moved something alive through here recently. Fresh fur. Fresh stains." Eleanor pressed the strand of hair into his hand. "It's not deer. Not elk. It's predator. If they're transporting wolves or bear cubs—" Her words faltered, her lips tightening. "This could destabilize the whole preserve." Buddy let out another sharp bark, ears forward. His limp made his movements deliberate, but his focus was unyielding. He strained towards the trees again, tail stiff. Michael followed his gaze, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew that look from his years with K-9 units. An animal catching scent, a signal that something living and urgent still lingered. The snow thickened, flakes driving sideways in the wind. Eleanor wrapped her cloak tighter, her slender frame shivering but her eyes resolute. She had seen enough fieldwork to know the cost of hesitation. She looked up at Michael, her voice firm despite the cold. "Something is trapped out there, Michael. And if we wait until morning, it may not survive." Hank straightened, wiping his gloved hands. "I'll radio the sheriff's office, let them know. But you two should head back inside. This isn't your fight today, it's your wedding." His tone carried authority, yet also a hint of gentleness. He respected Eleanor and Michael too much to order them outright, but he knew their nature would resist retreat. Michael's jaw set. "Hank, we can't ignore this. You know as well as I do, whoever left that truck isn't far. And Buddy—" He glanced at the old shepherd, who stood braced against the snow, eyes burning toward the woods. "Buddy didn't return after all these years to drag Eleanor back here for nothing." Hank hesitated, his instincts warring with protocol. Finally, he gave a short nod. All right. But we move careful. Tracks will vanish fast in this snow. If they've got snares set, one wrong step could cost us. Eleanor touched Buddy's back, her fingers steady despite the cold. She felt the tremor in his muscles, the urgency in his stance. He knows the way, she whispered. We just have to follow. The storm howled, swallowing their words, but the signal was clear. The gray pickup, the oily stain, the cage smeared with fur. Every detail pointed to a truth none of them could ignore. Somewhere in the endless wilderness of Yellowstone, something lived in chains. And if they didn't act soon, the silence of the snow might bury its cries forever. The snowstorm had not relented as Buddy led Eleanor and Michael beyond the edge of the lodge's lamplight into the wilderness of Yellowstone. The towering pines swayed under the weight of frost, their branches creaking like the groans of old wooden beams. The air was sharp, biting their cheeks and settling heavily in their lungs. Every crunch of their boots on the icy ground echoed unnaturally loud, as though the forest itself listened. Eleanor clutched her cloak tighter, the thin fabric of her wedding gown beneath doing little to protect her from the cold. She glanced at Michael, who moved steadily at her side, his jaw tight, his ranger's instincts drawn taut like a bowstring. Buddy, despite his limp, forged ahead with the determination of a younger dog, nose to the wind, amber eyes fixed forward. His gait was uneven, the old injury in his hind leg making each step deliberate, but his energy carried a force that urged the humans to follow without hesitation. They had gone nearly a mile into the forest when Michael raised his hand to halt them. His sharp eyes caught something unusual in the snow ahead. Boot tracks, partly filled with drifting powder, too fresh to belong to any tourist. He crouched, brushing snow away with a gloved hand, tracing the depth of the prints. His voice was low but certain. 2 men, heavy-set, moving fast, less than an hour ahead. Eleanor swallowed hard, her hazel eyes darting toward the darkened tree line. She had catalogued thousands of animal tracks in her career, yet human prints felt different, more threatening, more final. Before either of them could move again, a sudden crack split the air, a branch snapping beneath weight. Michael spun, hand reaching instinctively for his sidearm, but the snow-laden silence shattered as 2 figures emerged from behind the trees. Both wore heavy wool coats stained with mud and grease, their faces partially obscured by balaclavas. The first man was broad-shouldered, his eyes pale gray, framed by wrinkles that hinted at years of harsh outdoor labor. His beard, visible through the gaps in the mask, was unkempt, streaked with black and silver. He moved with the heaviness of a man long accustomed to violence, his hands large and scarred. The second was younger, wiry and restless, his frame thin beneath his layers, but his movements sharp and unpredictable. His eyes darted constantly, filled with nervous energy, as though fear and aggression waged war within him. Michael barely had time to react before the older man swung a rifle butt into his temple. The blow landed with sickening force, and Michael collapsed into the snow, blood already staining the whiteness beneath his head. Eleanor cried out, rushing toward him, but the younger man lunged, seizing her by the arms. She fought fiercely despite her slender build, her nails scratching at his coat, but he wrenched her backward and shoved her hard against a pine trunk. Rope was looped around her wrists with brutal efficiency, the fibers rough and biting into her skin. Another cloth was shoved into her mouth, muffling her protest. Buddy sprang forward, barking, his voice splitting the forest night. He lunged at the older man, teeth snapping close to his arm. The man cursed and kicked savagely, his boot slamming into Buddy's ribs. The dog fell sideways into the snow with a whimper, his paw striking against a hidden rock. Blood welled from a gash in the pad, staining the frost. For a moment, Buddy lay still, his sides heaving. But when Eleanor met his eyes, those steady amber eyes, he lifted his head again, crouching low, not retreating, but circling into the shadows like a soldier biding his time. The younger man tied Eleanor tighter against the tree, his breath reeking of tobacco as he leaned close, his voice a rasp. "Quiet, girl. No one's coming for you out here." His accent carried the rolling tones of the mountain communities, clipped and hardened by isolation. He pulled the knot firm and stepped back, glancing nervously toward Buddy, who now moved silently along the tree line. The older man grabbed Michael by the collar, dragging his limp body through the snow with ease, leaving a crimson streak behind. Eleanor's hazel eyes filled with tears as she strained against the ropes. Her arms throbbed, wrists burning where the fibers dug into her flesh. Her mind spun with terror for Michael, for the man who had been her anchor, her partner not only in research but in life. She tried to scream, but the gag reduced her voice to muffled sobs. The cold gnawed at her exposed skin, creeping deeper with each passing second. The younger man muttered, "Why not finish it now?" His eyes flicked nervously at the shadows where Buddy lingered. The older man's voice was gravelly, calm, the voice of someone who had seen too much blood to rush. "No, orders were clear. We take them deeper. Keep them quiet until the truck's ready." His tone held no sympathy, only a grim practicality that sent shivers through Eleanor's spine. As they vanished with Michael, Eleanor sagged against the tree, snow settling on her hair and lashes, freezing against her skin. She tried to twist her wrists free, but every movement only deepened the cuts. Her hazel eyes closed as she whispered in her mind, not aloud, a prayer carved from desperation. "Lord, if ever you were listening, let this not be the end. Give me a sign, a miracle, something." The forest answered only with the sigh of the wind. Yet a few yards away, Buddy crouched low, licking the blood from his injured paw. His sides rose and fell with each ragged breath, but his gaze never left Eleanor. His ears twitched at every sound, his nose twitching as he tracked the fading scent of Michael's blood. Though pain rippled through his body, his heart beat with the same unwavering instinct that had carried him through storms and avalanches years ago. He would not leave. He would wait, he would watch, and when the moment came, he would act. Bound to the pine, Eleanor lifted her eyes to the swirling heavens. Snow fell heavier now, burying the footprints of her captors, erasing the evidence as though the forest itself conspired to hide them. Her body shivered violently, but in her chest a spark refused to die. She fixed her gaze on Buddy's shadowed outline, whispering the only word she could form in her heart. Miracle. And in that frozen silence, though she could not yet know it, her prayer had already been heard. The forest had fallen into that terrible stillness that arrives when the storm pauses to gather strength. Eleanor's breath misted against the gag, her wrists raw from the rope cutting deeper with every futile twist. Her body shivered violently in the cold, her gown torn and clinging to her legs like a frozen shroud. She leaned her head back against the rough bark, despair clawing at her chest, when a soft crunch broke the silence. Her hazel eyes flicked downward, and there he was. Buddy, limping forward from the shadows, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, blood dripping from the torn pad of his paw. Snow clung to his muzzle, but his amber gaze glowed steady, unwavering, locked on her as if nothing else in the world existed. Buddy sniffed the air, circling her once, his tail stiff, every movement deliberate. He lowered his scarred muzzle to the rope, first tugging with his teeth, then pawing with blunt nails. Each pull frayed the fibers, each bite tearing at the knot until the strands began to loosen. Eleanor froze, holding her breath, afraid that any movement might break the fragile miracle unfolding before her. When the rope finally snapped with a brittle crack, her arms fell forward, blood rushing back to her fingers in painful tingles. She pulled the gag from her mouth and gasped the first free breath she had taken in what felt like hours. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse, tears streaking her pale cheeks. She dropped to her knees, her trembling hands burying themselves in the coarse fur around his neck. "It really is you." Her heart raced with recognition, memory colliding with reality. Years ago, she had been a young field researcher, assigned to the experimental K9 rescue unit. Buddy had been her constant companion, energetic, fearless, with a bark that could cut through avalanches. She had believed him lost in that blizzard, swallowed by snow and silence. Yet here he was, older, scarred, and limping, but alive. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his, sobbing into the fur that smelled of earth and pine. She, once the scientist and caretaker, now found herself the one saved, the one pulled from the edge by the very creature she had once trained. In that moment, the roles reversed, and she felt something stir deep within her. Faith not in science alone, but in a grace that defied logic. Buddy gave a low whine, pulling away to sniff the ground, his ears pricked. He had not finished. The air carried another scent, the acrid tang of oil mixed with rust, the heavy musk of an animal, and the faintest trace of Michael's blood. Eleanor rose unsteadily, clutching her cloak tighter around her, and followed as Buddy moved with careful urgency, his nose low, his limp more pronounced, but his will unbroken. The snow deepened, swallowing their steps, and the forest thickened until the trees stood like sentinels, their trunks black against the white drifts. It was then they saw it, a shack half-collapsed, leaning under the weight of snow, its planks weathered gray. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and a foul smell seeped from within, a mix of mold, oil, and animal musk. Eleanor hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. Buddy moved first, pushing his nose against the gap of the door and letting out a low growl. She reached forward with trembling hands, pushing it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. Inside, the air was rank and heavy. A single lantern flickered weakly, casting shadows across the cramped interior. Against one wall stood a crude pen fashioned from chain-link fencing and rusted bars. Inside, a small bear cub cowered, its fur matted, its ribs visible beneath the thin coat. A rusted shackle clamped around one paw, tethering it cruelly to an iron spike driven into the floor. The cub let out a whimper, shrinking back from the light, its wide, dark eyes filled with terror and exhaustion. Eleanor's breath caught, her heart breaking at the sight. She stepped forward instinctively, but Buddy blocked her path with his body, his growl low and constant. He was not warning her of the cub. He was warning her of something else. From the far side of the shack came another sound, a faint groan, human this time. Eleanor froze, her hazel eyes widening. She crept forward, brushing aside a curtain of burlap that hung over a partition. There, slumped against the wall, was Michael. His blonde hair was matted with blood, his face pale beneath the bruises, his strong frame now reduced to shallow breaths. His wrists were bound, his shirt torn, but when her trembling hand touched his cheek, his eyelids fluttered open. "Ellie," he rasped, his voice barely audible, but enough to send a wave of relief crashing through her. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I'm here, Michael. Hold on." He tried to speak again, but the effort was too much. His head sagged forward, and Eleanor pressed her lips to his brow, clinging to him as though her will alone could keep him alive. Buddy circled the shack, his ears twitching, his muzzle lifting as though testing the air for threats. His amber eyes caught Eleanor's, steady and unyielding, as if reminding her that the moment of reunion was only the beginning. The storm outside howled against the walls, and somewhere in the distance, footsteps crunched over snow. The poachers were not finished. Eleanor rose, wiping the tears from her face, her body trembling not with fear now, but with resolve. She had been the bride dressed in white, ready to vow her life to the man she loved. Now, in the freezing dark of the shack, she became something more, a survivor, a fighter, a woman who would not let her husband or the innocent cub die in chains. She reached for Buddy, laying a hand on his head, whispering fiercely, "We're not done yet. Show me the way." Buddy's tail flicked once, his ears pricked, and his gaze shifted back towards the door. The old dog limped forward, leading her not just out of the shack but into the next chapter of their fight for survival. The shack creaked in the wind, its walls rattling like bones under the weight of the storm. Eleanor's breath steamed in the lantern light as she crouched beside the bear cub, its whimpers cutting into her chest like glass. She brushed trembling fingers over her hair, now wild and tangled from struggle, her once pristine gown streaked with mud and blood. Her hazel eyes darted across the room until they landed on the iron shackle clamped around the cub's paw. The lock was crude but tight, its edges rusted, the chain bolted into the floor. She reached instinctively for her hair, her fingers finding the thin silver pin that had once fastened her veil. Pulling it free, she stared at it with determination. "Hold on," she whispered, not only to the cub but to herself. She knelt, slipping the pin into the lock. Her hands trembled with cold, but years of fieldwork had taught her patience and precision. She twisted, probing the grooves, while Buddy circled close, his amber eyes fixed on the doorway, every muscle tense. The sound of the tumblers shifting was faint, but to Eleanor it was thunder in her ears. At last the lock clicked open, and the chain fell away. The cub whimpered again, hesitated, then pressed its head briefly against her arm as if recognizing her as savior before stumbling free. Michael groaned softly from where he leaned against the wall, his blonde hair plastered with dried blood. Eleanor rushed to him, her slender frame kneeling beside his broad shoulders. She tore at his bindings until Buddy pressed forward, his jaws snapping through the rope with steady bites. Michael exhaled in relief, slumping into Eleanor's arms. His green eyes, though fogged with pain, still carried that steeliness she knew so well, the gaze of a ranger who had faced storms before. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice shaking but urgent. Michael coughed, his chest heaving as he forced himself upright. "Not fast," he admitted, his voice gravelly, "but enough." Together, with Eleanor supporting one arm and Buddy pressing close for balance, they moved toward the door. The bear cub limped behind, its tiny claws clicking against the warped wooden floor. Outside, the night was cruel, the snow whipping sideways, disguising sound and movement. Eleanor stepped into the open, only to freeze as the low roar of an engine broke through the storm. A pair of headlights flared to life across the clearing. A gray pickup truck, battered and heavy, skidded across the snow, its tires spitting slush like knives. The driver slammed the horn, the blare echoing off the pines. The vehicle hurtled forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Michael shoved Eleanor back toward the tree line, his large frame shielding hers. "Run!" he barked, his voice laced with authority even through exhaustion. He staggered into the open, his arms raised as if to block the truck. The driver didn't brake. The engine screamed, the grill bearing down like a charging beast. At the last second, Michael dove aside, the truck fishtailing past, skimming his boot with a spray of ice. It roared into a wide arc, circling back. Buddy leapt forward, barking furiously, his voice carrying above the storm. His body, scarred and limping, radiated defiance. He planted himself between the truck and his humans, barking again and again, short, sharp signals, not just warnings. Eleanor recognized it. This was how he had been trained years ago, to signal allies, to call for reinforcements. Her heart hammered. "Buddy, the radio," she murmured. Her eyes flicked back to the shack. Somewhere in her desperate search, she had glimpsed a small metal box, half buried under rags. The emergency field radio. If the poachers had overlooked it, then maybe, just maybe. Michael caught her gaze. His lips split into a grim smile. "Go," he ordered, though his body sagged with weakness. "I'll hold them." "No," Eleanor said fiercely, clutching his arm. "We'll hold them. Together." The truck screeched again, tires spinning as it tried to pivot for another pass. Buddy darted aside, leading the bear cub and its jingling chain fragment toward the tree line. His bark split the night once more, rhythmic, measured, as if sending a coded call across the wilderness. Eleanor dragged Michael back into the shack, her fingers flying as she tore aside the rags. There it was. A battered radio unit, its casing dented but the antenna still intact. She fumbled with the knobs, her frozen fingers clumsy, until static hissed in her ears. She pressed the transmitter. "This is Eleanor Ward, biologist at Yellowstone Reserve. Emergency. Poachers, armed, near the North Trail Shack. Please respond." Her voice cracked with desperation. For a heartbeat, only static answered. Then a man's voice, low and steady, broke through. "Copy that. This is Ranger Station West. We're on your signal. Hold tight." Relief flooded Eleanor's chest, but it was fleeting. The shack shook as the pickup slammed into its side, wood splintering. Michael dragged her down as debris rained. The lantern shattered, plunging them into near darkness. Buddy growled outside, the sound of claws scraping ice as he dodged the truck's renewed charge. "Time to move," Michael grunted, pushing himself upright despite the pain. Together they stumbled out the back, snow pelting their faces. Buddy appeared instantly, pressing close, his fur bristling with both fear and determination. The cub huddled at Eleanor's legs, shivering but moving. They plunged into the forest, branches whipping against their faces, their boots sinking deep into drifts. Behind them, the truck's engine roared, headlights lancing through the trees like hunting eyes. Eleanor's lungs burned with each breath, her thin frame driven by adrenaline. Michael stumbled, his strength failing, but Buddy darted back to press his body against the ranger's leg, guiding him forward. The barks came, again, louder, desperate, echoing through the forest. To Eleanor they sounded like a beacon, a plea for unseen allies to come quickly. And in the distance, faint but undeniable, another sound answered. The far-off rumble of engines, the staccato crackle of radios, the voices of more rangers converging on the signal. The chase thundered on, snow flying, until Eleanor dared to believe that the tide was shifting. But the night was far from over, and the forest still held its breath for what came next. The forest no longer felt like a prison of snow. It had become a theater of confrontation. Eleanor staggered against Michael's side as the faint hum of more engines swelled through the storm. The beam of flashlights cut between the trees like silver swords. Voices barked orders. "Circle north! Keep low! Cover the road!" From the darkness, uniformed figures emerged. Rangers in thick winter coats with rifles slung across their chests, their boots crunching decisively through the drifts. Behind them followed sheriff's deputies, identifiable by their olive jackets and heavy belts, eyes sharp under the brims of their hats. At their head strode Ranger Captain Samuel Grant, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. His salt and pepper beard framed a square jaw, and his weather-worn face bore the creases of decades patrolling America's wildest frontiers. His deep-set blue eyes scanned everything with the precision of a hawk. Samuel was known for being uncompromising, respected, sometimes feared, because 20 years earlier he had nearly lost his team in a wildfire raid against armed poachers. Since then, he treated every confrontation as life or death. His voice now boomed above the wind, calm but commanding. "Secure the perimeter. Nobody in, nobody out." The gray pickup, its headlights still glaring, tried to reverse through the snow, but deputies closed in, guns drawn. "Hands where I can see them!" one barked. Two men leapt from the cab, their faces twisted with fury and fear. They were wiry, dressed in layers of patched canvas and fur, their boots caked with blood and grease. The taller one had a jagged scar running across his cheek, and the other's left ear was missing its tip. They froze under the blinding flashlights, the rifles trained on them, the sharp click of safeties disengaging echoing like thunder. Buddy limped forward, growling, his hackles raised. Despite his age, he radiated authority, his bark splitting the night with such force that the two men flinched as if confronted by something more than a dog. Eleanor clutched Michael tighter, whispering a prayer of thanks as she saw the tightening cordon of law closing around the hunters. The pickup's doors were thrown wide. Inside, under the dim glow of a cabin light, the horror was revealed. Bundled in the back seat were bloodied pelts, wolf hides, lynx fur, even the stripped remains of foxes. The bed of the truck held something worse. Iron cages smeared with blood, broken snares twisted with tufts of deer hair, and an insulated chest reeking of death. When Captain Samuel pried it open, the gathered officers recoiled. Inside were sawn antlers, stripped illegally from elk, some still slick with marrow. Atop the grisly pile lay a ledger, its pages stained with oil but filled with precise handwriting, quantities, prices, dates, and destinations. A black market catalog. Samuel held it aloft, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a weekend hunter," he growled. "This is commerce, organized." He snapped at his men. "Photograph everything. Tag the evidence. Nobody touches that ledger but me." Eleanor pressed her hands to her lips, horrified. "They weren't just killing," she whispered. "They were supplying." Michael, his breath still ragged but his mind sharpening, nodded grimly. "This is a network. Someone's buying. Someone's moving product out of Yellowstone." Buddy's bark interrupted them again, sharp and insistent. He darted from the truck toward the tree line, nose pressed low, tail stiff. He looked back, whined, then barked once more, a clear signal. Eleanor's heart skipped. "He's found something else." "Follow him," Samuel ordered, gesturing to two deputies. "But don't get ahead of him. He knows more than you do right now." Buddy led them through the snow, paws leaving a crimson trail from his injured pad, but his resolve was unbroken. They reached a hollow beneath an outcrop of stone where the snow had been cleared away. Hidden beneath a tarpaulin were cages, at least 6, each holding animals in various states of suffering. A bobcat with a bloodied leg, its eyes still fierce despite the wound. 2 red fox kits huddled together, shivering. A young elk calf with a torn flank, its breath shallow. And in the last cage, a golden eagle with one wing twisted unnaturally, its fierce eyes burning with fury even in its pain. Eleanor knelt by the cages, tears spilling freely. "Oh, God, how long have they been here?" she whispered. The animals looked back at her, some with fear, some with defiance, all with the desperate will to survive. Behind her, Samuel's men muttered curses, their faces pale. "This isn't hunting," one ranger spat. "This is butchery." Samuel's gaze hardened. He placed a heavy hand on Eleanor's shoulder. These animals wouldn't still be alive if not for you finding them. Or that dog. Michael steadied himself against a tree, his broad chest heaving. No, not just her. Buddy was the one who led us here. He's always been that kind of dog. His voice cracked slightly, not from pain but from awe. Samuel turned his gaze to the German shepherd, who sat stiffly by the eagle's cage, ears perked, amber eyes burning. The old dog looked like a warrior from another life, scarred but unbowed. Samuel gave a rare smile, thin but sincere. Then tonight, that dog is a ranger. While the animals were sedated and lifted into transport crates for veterinary care, deputies secured the captured poachers. One, the scarred man, hissed through his teeth. "You think this ends with us? There's more than you can stop." His eyes glinted with malice before he was shoved into the back of a patrol truck. Eleanor shuddered, the man's words echoing in her ears. She turned to Michael, who squeezed her hand gently, despite his bruises. "He's right about one thing," Michael said quietly. "This isn't over. We just tore the corner off something much larger." Snow swirled as the convoy of rangers and deputies prepared to leave, headlights cutting tunnels through the darkness. Eleanor watched the cages being loaded, the cub nestled safely under blankets, the eagle glaring defiantly even as it was lifted. Beside her, Buddy sat, tail brushing lightly against her gown, his eyes never leaving the tree line, as though he expected more shadows to emerge. For the first time that night, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. Not fully, not easily, but with a fragile hope. They had uncovered a wound in the heart of Yellowstone, a scar inflicted by greed. But perhaps, with Buddy leading them, they could begin to heal it. The storm that had raged for days finally broke. By late afternoon, the sky above Yellowstone glowed with the soft amber light of a winter sunset, golden shafts spilling between the towering lodgepole pines. Snow still blanketed the meadows, but it no longer felt like a shroud. Instead, it gleamed like a fresh altar, clean and waiting. The air was sharp but calm, and in that stillness, the survivors of the ordeal gathered. Eleanor stood at the center of the clearing, her wedding gown torn and streaked with mud, dried blood marking its once pristine hem. Yet no one saw the ruin. They saw the fire in her hazel eyes, the way her long brown hair caught the light, the proud tilt of her slender frame that had endured chains and fear and still stood tall. Her skin was pale from cold, but her smile radiated warmth enough to thaw the chill. She was no longer simply the bride of the morning. She was a woman reborn, baptized by snow, by danger, and by faith. At her side stood Michael, his tall figure wrapped in a ranger's heavy coat that could not conceal the bruises shadowing his square jaw or the stiff way he carried his ribs. His blonde hair was tousled, his green eyes weary but steady. The ordeal had carved lines of pain into his face, but those lines only made his gaze fiercer, the look of a man who had faced death and chosen to live for more than himself. His large hands, still rough from years of outdoor work, now held Eleanor's slender fingers with a gentleness that seemed to promise eternity. Buddy sat between them, the old German shepherd limping slightly as he adjusted his position on the snowy ground. His fur, once sable and tan, was streaked with gray around the muzzle and ears, his eyes amber and knowing. A deep scar cut across his brow, and his right paw was still wrapped in a makeshift bandage, but none of that diminished the dignity he carried. Around his neck was a navy blue bandana, hastily tied by one of the rangers, marking him as something more than a companion. Today he was the honored witness, the guardian of vows. The ceremony was not held inside a chapel, nor beneath a decorated arch. Instead, It unfolded in the open clearing, where pines rose like silent guardians, and the sky itself seemed to bow down to listen. A small group of rangers, deputies, and townsfolk had gathered, their faces still bearing the fatigue of the night's hunt, yet softened now by relief. The bear cub they had rescued rested inside a padded crate nearby, sleeping peacefully, while the other injured animals had been transported to rehabilitation centers earlier that day. The officiant, Father Thomas Brennan, stepped forward. He was a man in his 60s, tall and slightly stooped, with thinning white hair combed neatly and spectacles perched on the bridge of his narrow nose. His face was weathered, his skin sun-touched from years serving rural congregations, and his voice carried the calm conviction of one who had spent decades speaking of faith in barns, fields, and mountain lodges. Known for his humility, he often said he had seen God more clearly in the flight of an eagle or the birth of a calf than in any stone cathedral. He raised his hands slightly, the fading sun haloing him, and spoke. "Love, like the wilderness around us, is both fragile and fierce. Today, Eleanor and Michael return to their vows, not as a promise untouched by trial, but as a covenant forged in fire and storm." His words resonated against the trunks of the pines, carried by the crisp air. Michael turned to Eleanor, his battered frame trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the enormity of the moment. His voice was low, steady, shaped by the gravity of a ranger's oath. "Eleanor, I came to this day ready to vow myself to you alone. But now I see more clearly. My love for you is bound to this land, to the lives we protect. I swear that every breath I draw will serve not just us, but the wild that gave us Buddy back, and the grace that kept us alive." Eleanor's eyes filled, tears glimmering like the frost on pine needles. She lifted her chin, her voice carrying strong though her body trembled. "Michael, when I was bound in darkness, I prayed for rescue, and God sent not an army, but a dog I once thought lost. That miracle reminded me. Kindness echoes, even when we think it has been buried beneath the snow. So I vow, my life, my work, my love will be given to you, to every wild heart that beats in this park, and to the one who watches us from above." The clearing fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Buddy shifted, lowering his head, as though he too understood the sanctity of the moment. Father Brennan lifted his hand in blessing. "May the vows spoken here echo longer than fear, stronger than shadow. What God has joined in this clearing, let no trial undo." As the couple leaned forward, lips meeting beneath the golden glow of sunset, the gathered witnesses released a quiet breath of awe. The light broke through the clouds above, a sudden clearing in the winter sky, revealing a patch of radiant blue. To many, it seemed like heaven itself had opened in silent benediction. Buddy barked once, a deep, steady sound that rolled across the meadow. The rangers chuckled softly, and one murmured, "Even the best man approves." The ceremony closed not with applause, but with reverent silence. Eleanor looked at the faces around her, friends, colleagues, strangers bound now by a night of danger, and then raised her voice. "Remember this. The echo of kindness never disappears. It returns, even when we think it lost under snow. It found us, through Buddy, and it can find the world, if we choose to give it." The people bowed their heads, and for a fleeting moment, the vastness of Yellowstone felt like a cathedral, its spires made of pine, its stained glass the fire of sunset, its hymn the heartbeat of the wild. In the silence of Yellowstone's pines, as vows were spoken beneath the fading sun, it became clear that miracles are not always thunderous or grand. Sometimes God answers through small echoes, an old dog limping back from the shadows, a wild cub set free, a love that survives chains and storms. These moments remind us that His grace often walks quietly among us, clothed in loyalty, courage, and kindness. And just as Buddy returned when hope seemed lost, so too can miracles find you in your own life, through a stranger's kindness, a friend's hand, or a prayer whispered in the night. Never doubt that God works in ways we cannot see, weaving redemption even through brokenness. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below about a miracle you've witnessed, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep these echoes of faith alive together. May God bless you, your loved ones, and may His light guide your steps through every shadow.